The air in the meadow below was thin and carried the metallic taste of coming snow. It was March 16th, 1244. Soldiers, there dulled by a winter of siege, worked with a grim efficiency, their movements sharp and angular against the backdrop of the Pyrenean peaks. They were not building a barracks or a fortification. They were building a pyre. The structure grew with an obscene geometry, a scaffold of green oak and pine that promised a slow, smoky burn. This was not a place of battle. It was a place of accounting. Before we witness the final entry in this terrible ledger, consider subscribing. The path that led to this field is a story the victors tried to erase with fire, and its secrets are not all lost. From the surrendered fortress perched high on its rocky pog, a procession began. They did not march like the vanquished. There were no chains, no prods from the spears of the royal army. Over 200 men and women descended the steep path, their worn wool robes fluttering in the wind that swept down from the mountain's summit. They were singing. It was not a lament, but a quiet hymn whose melody seemed alien to the ears of the crusading knights, a tune that spoke of light and release, not of ash and bone. Seneschalov watched from horseback, his gloved hand resting on his saddle's pommel. He had spent months starving these people out, watching his own men freeze and fall to arrows from the ramparts. He had expected to see broken, hollowed-out heretics. He saw something else. He saw the daughter of the castle's lord, her face pale but serene, her eyes fixed not on the monstrous pyre awaiting her, but on something beyond it, something he could not see. She, like the others, had refused the offer of the inquisitors, a simple confession, an abjuration of their faith, and they could have walked away. None did. The singing grew louder as they reached the field, a sound that did not plead for mercy but seemed to grant it. The soldiers, men who had faced Saracen blades and English longbows, shifted uneasily. They could understand a man dying for his king, for his land. They could not comprehend this placid march into the heart of a furnace. The Cathar bishop, Marty, frail and old, led them not to the stake, but through an opening in the palisade surrounding the pyre. They were not thrown in. They walked in. They arranged themselves within the cage of wood, some helping the elderly find a place to sit, as if preparing for a final sermon. What doctrine could arm a soul so completely against the most primal fear? What words, written in what forbidden book, could convince over 200 people to view their own immolation as a liberation? Felt the heat lick at his face as the first torches were thrown. The green wood sputtered, caught, and then roared, the flames climbing like greedy orange tongues. The singing did not stop. For a time it was the only sound, a strange, ethereal counterpoint to the crackle and hiss of the fire. It rose with the smoke, a column of defiant harmony against a gray sky, until one by one the voices were silenced. The stench of it was absolute. Not just burning wood and cloth, but something deeper, something that clung to the back of the throat and coiled in the stomach. It was the smell of conviction turned to carbon. Yet for a colder thought settled in the pit of his gut, a failure that gnawed at the edges of his victory. 2 weeks earlier, under a truce, 4 men had been lowered down the sheer western face of the fortress wall on ropes. They had moved in the dead of night, vanishing into the labyrinthine gorges of They were not fighters. They were Cathar perfects, the keepers of the faith, and with them they carried something. A bundle. The refugees and soldiers interrogated after the surrender had all spoken of it. their stories aligning with a terrifying consistency. They had carried the treasure. The royal army had found no gold, no silver, no cache of jewels within its walls. The fortress was destitute, its larders empty, its coffers bare. The treasure was something else. As he watched the last of the flames consume the last of the bodies, the seneschal was not thinking of the souls he had sent to his God for judgment. He was thinking of those four shadows slipping away in the dark. He was thinking of the documents, the sacred texts, the gospels of a faith he was sent to destroy. The fire had claimed the believers, but had he only succeeded in scattering the belief? The bodies were ash, but the words, where were the words? The smoke, now thin and gray, no longer carried the scent of pine, but of a butcher's shop left open to the sun. Remained on his horse, a statue of iron and leather, long after the last of his captains had retired to the warmth of their tents. The silence that followed the singing was not peace. It was a vacuum, a hollow space in the world where 200 souls had been. He had won. The royal standard would fly over, yet the victory felt like ash in his mouth. He dismounted, his knees stiff from the cold and the long vigil. The ground around the pyre was a black, greasy circle. His soldiers kept their distance, their talk muted, their glances toward the smoldering mound both fearful and furtive. They had performed their duty, but something in the manner of the Cathars' deaths had unsettled them more than any battle. It had been an execution, yes, but it had felt like a ritual in which the crusaders were merely unwilling acolytes. Gestured to a sergeant, "Double the patrols on the mountain passes. I want every shepherd, every charcoal burner, every woodsman from here to the county of questioned. I want 4 men." The sergeant's face was blank. "4 men, my lord." His voice was a low rasp. "They are not soldiers, they look like priests, old, they will be on foot, find them." This was the gnawing worm in the heart of his triumph. Not the heresy he had cauterized, but the infection he might have just released into the bloodstream of. What secrets did they carry, wrapped in oilcloth and leather? What words could make a pyre look like a gateway? Hours later, in the cold air of the captured fortress's great hall, the seneschal faced. The former lord of sat not in chains, but on a simple wooden stool, his face a mask of weary resignation. He had surrendered his castle to save the garrison, the men-at-arms who served him but did not share the faith of the perfects. He had been spared. His wife and daughter had not. Paced before him, the clink of his spurs the only sound in the cavernous room. 4 men, I gave my word that your garrison would be spared. Do not make me regret my honor. Looked up, his eyes not focusing on the seneschal but on the smoke-stained tapestry behind him. They are called and, he said, his voice flat, the other 2, just brothers. They carry nothing of value to you. Gold, jewels, the church tithes you've been hoarding for a generation, pressed, leaning in close. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of the dead. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the old man's lips. You look for a king's treasure, seneschal. You think in terms of coin and weight. What they carry has no weight. And no price. He looked at them, a direct, piercing gaze. It is a light for the dark times ahead. You cannot seize it. You can only be blind to it. The words were not a taunt. They were a statement of fact, delivered with a finality that made the seneschal's hand clench into a fist. He was being offered a riddle when he needed a map. The frustration was still coiling in his gut when another presence entered the hall. The Dominican inquisitor, brother, moved with a soundless tread, his white habit a stark slash against the gloom. His face was thin, ascetic, his eyes burning with a fervor that made military pragmatism feel coarse and worldly. Ignored the prisoner, his gaze fixed on the seneschal. A glorious day, a great cleansing. The wolves have been thrown into the fire. 4 of them slipped the pen, countered, his tone sharp. The most important ones. They took the source of the poison with them. Waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of profound irritation. Details. We made a spectacle of heresy. We showed the people of this land that the Church's arm is long and its memory eternal. We burned the body of their false church. The soul will wither. And what if it doesn't? Shot back. What if the soul is not in the bodies we burned, but in the writings they saved? A book can be. A belief can take root in a new field. I have contained a plague to this mountain, and now I fear we have allowed its most potent seeds to be carried to the 4 winds. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. For the first time, a flicker of something other than pious certainty appeared in his expression. It was a cold, calculating glint. What writings? The treasure, said, the word tasting like poison. The Cathar Gospels. Their book of the 2 principles. Perhaps even the one they call the Gospel of John, a version our Holy Father in Rome would not recognize. For a long moment, the hall was utterly still. The Inquisitor, the soldier, and the ruined lord were suspended in a triangle of silent conflict. Understood texts. He understood the power of a single sentence to create or destroy a world. The physical immolation was for the peasants, a crude but necessary lesson. The true war, the war he was uniquely qualified to fight, was a war of ink and parchment. The escape of the men was a nuisance. The escape of their books was a catastrophe. Find them, whispered, the words no longer dismissive but a sharp, venomous command. Find them and what they carry. I will write the permissions. You will have access to any resource, any man, but the items they carry, they are to be brought to me, untouched. Unread, he looked past at, and he will tell us the path they took. But when turned, the stool was empty. In the commotion of the Inquisitor's arrival, the old man, a ghost in his own home, had simply vanished back into the fortress's shadows. The hunt began not with a gallop, but with a whisper. Did not send a squadron of knights. He sent one man, a tracker from the high mountains of Aragon, a man known only as, whose face was a map of wind-burn and secrets. He was given no orders but to find the trail of 4 old men moving at night through the most unforgiving terrain in the Pyrenees. He was not to engage. He was to watch. He was to follow. For days there was nothing. The mountain held its secrets tight. The patrols found only scared shepherds and empty caves. The seneschal's victory was already being written into the chronicles, a celebrated triumph for the King of France and the Holy Church. But for the days grew longer, the nights colder. He slept little, his dreams filled with the phantom melody of the Cathar hymn. Then, on the 9th day, a rider arrived. He did not carry a message from. He carried a small, crudely carved piece of wood, found by a goat herd near the entrance to the caves of a day's hard ride to the west. It was a fish, an ancient symbol almost forgotten, had sent it as proof. He had found a thread, far below the earth, in a chamber where the air never stirred and the darkness was absolute. 4 men huddled around a single tallow lamp. The flame was a fragile star in an infinite night. One of them coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed unnervingly in the vast silence. His hands, gnarled with age, rested on a heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. He did not open it. He did not need to. He could feel the power of the words within, sleeping, waiting. Younger and stronger, listened at the mouth of their hiding place, his ear pressed to the cold stone, straining to hear anything beyond the slow, steady drip of water that was the mountain's own quiet heartbeat. He heard nothing. But he felt it, a pressure change in the world above. The hunter had found the scent. The air in the chamber did not move. It was ancient, heavy, tasting of wet limestone and the dust of ages. Took his ear from the rock, his senses reaching into the oppressive quiet. He heard only the metronome of a single drop of water striking a stalagmite somewhere in the blackness, a sound that measured out an eternity between each impact. He felt the hunter, though. It was not a sound or a vibration, but a disturbance in the stillness, a wrongness that prickled the hairs on his arms. The world outside their sanctuary had become a snare. "He knows," whispered the sound barely disturbing the air. His voice was a dry rasp. "He does not know where, but he knows which forest." Did not look up. His focus was on the bundle resting across his thin lap, its oilcloth skin gleaming faintly in the light of the single lamp. His hands, like bundles of dried twigs, hovered over it, not quite touching, as if its contents were a low-burning fire that might scorch him even through the protective layers. "Then we must not be in the forest when he looks," replied. His own voice was thin, perforated by the cough that was slowly grinding his lungs to dust. "This mountain has deeper veins than the man-made tunnels of. It has its own memory. We will walk through its sleep." The other two brothers, and Tristan, their faces indistinguishable in the faint light, looked from too. They were followers, their faith a shield, their purpose simple, to carry, to obey, to protect the men who protected the word. Their fear was a simple, practical thing. The hunter was a more complex poison. Knelt. The Western passages. No one has used them since the time of the grandfathers. They say the mountain breathes in those tunnels, that the air comes and goes with a will of its own. "Then we will learn its rhythm," said, a flicker of iron in his tone. He finally looked at, and in the dimness, his eyes seemed to hold their own light, a reflection of the knowledge he guarded. The seneschal and his inquisitor think in straight lines. They think of roads and passes. They will search the surface. We will become a rumor in the rock. What path could lead from one darkness into another, deeper still? What forgotten geography could swallow four men so completely that they might as well have been consumed by the fire with their brethren? At the foot of the mountain, in a hastily assembled command tent, the wooden fish lay on a field map. It was small, no bigger than a man's thumb and crudely whittled, yet it dominated the space. Stared at it, seeing not a symbol of faith but a mark of passage, a piece of insolence left by his quarry. It was a message. We were here. "You are slow." Brother picked it up, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a scorpion. He hissed, the word a venomous dart. "They mock us. They play at being the first apostles, hiding in their catacombs. They are not martyrs. They are vermin, and this is their spoor." His knuckles were white. The cool, pious certainty he had displayed at the pyre was gone, burned away by a more personal, more intellectual fury. This was no longer a simple matter of purging heresy. It was a direct challenge to his authority over the sacred narrative itself. It tells us they are in the cave system, said, his voice a low counterpoint to agitation. He tapped the map. It is a maze. A city underground. I could send 100 men in there and lose them all. You will not, commanded, his eyes burning. You will seal it, every entrance, every fissure a man could squeeze through. Let them have their catacomb. Let it be their tomb. Felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. And the texts, they will be lost, buried. Better lost than read, snapped. Better they rot with their keepers than see the light of day. Some words are a plague, seneschal. They do not merely convince the mind. They unravel the very fabric of the world God has made. The thing they call the Book of the Two Principles. It posits a creation born not of love, but of struggle. Of two equal, warring gods. It turns our Holy Father into the priest of a lesser deity, a cosmic usurper. He was no longer speaking to, but to the shadows in the tent. He was seeing the infection spread, the carefully constructed reality of his world decaying at its roots. Looked from the Inquisitor's feverish face to the map. Sealing the caves was a crude solution, a butcher's work, and it felt wrong. These men were not fools. They would not have chosen a place from which there was no escape. His message was a confirmation of the trail, not its end. The tracker would not expect him to simply wall up the mountain. He would expect a hunt. My tracker is still out there, stated, the words a quiet rebellion. He will not be looking for exits. He will be looking for their next mistake. Deep within the earth, there was no day or night. Time was measured in the sputtering life of their lamp and the growing ache in their bones. They moved through a passage so narrow they had to turn sideways, the rock scraping their backs and chests. Clutching the precious bundle to his body was gasping, each breath a painful whistle. The air was thin and foul, smelling of minerals and a deep, stagnant cold. Led the way, one hand outstretched into the darkness, the other held against the rough-hewn wall. He was their eyes, their compass in this blind world. He navigated by memory, by stories passed down, and by the feel of the air. He felt a draft, a current so faint it was barely perceptible, a sign of a larger chamber ahead, or a way out. Here, he said, stopping, the passage should widen. As he spoke, the brother behind him stumbled in the dark. There was a sickening crack, not of bone, but of pottery, a small water skin their last, shattered on the stone floor. The sound was catastrophically loud in the immense silence. For a moment, no one moved. The last of their water trickled away, vanishing instantly into the porous rock. It was a death sentence delivered in a whisper. Thirst was now a more immediate hunter than the man on the surface. How long could they survive in a world of stone, with the source of life now just a dark stain at their feet? Found the cave entrance just after dawn. It was not a grand opening, but a fracture in a cliff face, obscured by gorse and shadow. A lesser man would have walked past it a dozen times. Had seen the single, misplaced stone near its mouth, a sign that something had passed that did not belong to the mountain. He did not enter. He sat on a rock 50 paces away, a stillness falling over him that made him part of the landscape. He ate a piece of hard cheese and dry bread, his eyes never leaving the dark slit. He was a patient man. He knew that creatures in a burrow must eventually come out for water or be driven out by their own filth. He would wait. The mountain would give him his sign. He waited for a day and a night. The silence from the cave was absolute, too absolute. On the morning of the second day, he knew. He had been tricked. This was not the lair. This was the back door left deliberately ajar. They were not inside. They had been here and they had gone. He moved then, not with haste, but with a new intensity. He circled the area, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the rocks, not for a trail of 4 men, but for the trail of one. Theirs was a cold scent, days old. But a new trail might have been laid to confuse, to distract. He found nothing. They had vanished from the earth. Frustrated, he returned to the entrance, this time entering the first few feet of the cave. The air was cold still. He lit a small torch. The floor was dusty, undisturbed, except for one spot. Something was drawn in the dust, not a symbol but a diagram. It was a series of connected circles and lines, a crude celestial map. In the center, one circle was shaded darker than the rest, and beside it, almost invisible, a single word had been scrawled with a finger. Did not know the word, but he knew it was not a name. It was a destination. He extinguished his torch, memorized the diagram, and scuffed it out with his boot. The hunt had changed. It was no longer a pursuit. It was a race. Far away in the labyrinth, paused. His body trembled with exhaustion. The thirst was a fire in his throat. He leaned against, his breath a ragged whisper. "Did you leave it?" he asked. "I did," confirmed, his own voice hoarse. "He will see it as a map," rasped, a faint, dry smile on his lips. "A clue to where we are going." "And it is?" asked Tristan, his voice hollow with fear and dehydration. "It is a map to a lie," said, shifting weight. "Let them chase a phantom to the caves. It will buy us the time we need." He looked into the suffocating darkness ahead. "The true path is far harder, and it does not lead west." They had sacrificed their last water, but they had purchased something more valuable. A day, perhaps 2. But in the crushing dark, with the fire of thirst beginning to consume them, a day felt like a lifetime and an eternity. The echo of words, a map to a lie, offered no comfort. It was a strategic victory in a war they were losing to their own bodies. The darkness they moved through was no longer a shield. It was a tomb in the making. Tristan, his faith abraded to a raw nerve, began to weep, a thin, rasping sound that the rock seemed to drink without echo. Thirst was a clawed thing in his throat, and every memory of water, a cup, a puddle, a single drop of rain, was a separate torment. "Be silent," hissed, his own voice cracking. "Your fear is a noise that will draw them." A dead weight supported by stirred. His breath was a shallow tide against the shore of life. "The boy is not afraid of the seneschal," he whispered, the words taking a terrible effort. "He is afraid of God's absence. He looks for a sign in a place where God has not yet spoken." He coughed, a dry spasm that shook his entire frame, felt the tremor and adjusted his grip, the old man's bones feeling as fragile as a bird's cage. The bundle of texts pressed between them was the only solid thing in their world. Felt the wall beside him change. The rough, jagged limestone gave way to something smoother, colder. He stopped. "The air," he said, tilting his head, "it's moving." It was the mountain breathing. A slow, immense exhalation of cold, damp air flowed past them, carrying a new scent. It was not the mineral smell of stone or the foulness of stagnant water. It was the smell of rot, but a green, living rot. The smell of a forest floor where sunlight has never touched. He took a step forward and his foot slipped, not on rock, but on something soft and slick. Kneeling, ignoring the protests of his parched throat, he touched the ground. Faintly in the glow of their near-exhausted lamp, he saw a pale, ghostly luminescence, a carpet of phosphorescent moss feeding on the perpetual damp, and from it, sprouting in clusters, were fungi, stark white and shaped like cupped hands. They had found the mountain's hidden garden, and its well. Water seeped from the mossy walls, gathering in the cups of the spectral fungus. Was this the sign had spoken of, or was it a new and more subtle poison? Rode not like a soldier, but like a river flowing downhill. He and his horse moved as one entity, finding the path of least resistance through the rugged foothills of the. He did not follow roads. Roads were for merchants and armies. He followed the contours of the land, the forgotten shepherd's tracks, the game trails that were old when the Romans came. The diagram he had seen in the dust was burned into his mind. The star map pointed to the caves at a place known for its hot springs and pagan histories. It felt right. Heretics hiding in a place of old heresies. He skirted the villages, a ghost in the landscape, his presence marked only by a startled sheepdog or a child, who would later speak of a man who looked like he was carved from the mountainside. He was a hunter, and his quarry had given him a scent, a direction. The frustration of the long wait had been replaced by the clean, cold thrill of the chase. He did not question the clue. Pride was a luxury for lords in tents. His trade was in observation and pursuit. A map was a map. He was simply the instrument meant to follow it. By the second evening, he saw the smoke from the cooking fires. Not the lone campfire of a shepherd, but the ordered grid of a military encampment. Men. They had moved faster than he expected. The seneschal was not a man to let a lead grow cold. Dismounted, cooled his horse, and approached the camp not as the hunter returning, but as a shadow rejoining its owner. Brother repeated, the word tasting of victory. He stood before the captured map's tent, his finger tracing a line from two. He confirms it. My prayers have been answered. The heretics have been delivered into our hands. Studied the courier who had brought's message. The man was exhausted, but his eyes held the tracker's confidence. He says they are in the caves. He believes they are headed there. He is certain of the destination, the courier clarified. He requests a small, fast-moving contingent to seal the upper exits above the gorge La Frau. He will drive them into the main entrance at. A trap mused. It was a sound military plan, simple, brutal, effective. No, said, and the single word cut through the tense, smoky air. All eyes turned to him. His face was illuminated by the lantern, his expression one of ecstatic, terrifying clarity. Not a trap, a tribunal. I will not have them buried in the dark with their lies. I will not have them martyred by a rockfall. That is your way, seneschal. A soldier's solution. It is messy. It is insufficient. His patience, worn thin by sleepless nights and the gnawing sense of an unfinished task, finally snapped. And what is your sufficient solution, brother inquisitor? Do we invite them to a debate, offer them refreshments? His eyes glittered. You will surround the caves. You will let them enter. You will let them believe they have found their final sanctuary. And when they are deep inside, in the great chamber they call the cathedral, I will meet them. He looked at a predator smiling at a butcher. You burn the body to make a statement to the crowd. But you must dissect the soul to truly kill the idea. I will take their book from their hands, and I will show them, verse by verse, the pathetic architecture of their own damnation. They will not be burned as prophets. They will be exposed as fools. Their faith will die not in fire but in shame. The seneschal felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was a man who understood killing. He understood strategy and logistics. He did not understand this. This was a violation of some unspoken rule of conflict, a descent into a kind of personal warfare that felt more profane than any heresy. He had wanted a map. He had been dragged into a theology. But the Inquisitor's authority, backed by a fresh seal from Toulouse, was absolute. He had his orders. The water from the fungus was clean, tasting only of cold and stone. It saved them. For 2 days they rested in the phosphorescent grotto, the pale blue-green light a constant, dream-like dawn. Tristan's weeping subsided, replaced by a silent awe. Practical mapped the strange cavern, trying to understand its geography. Tended to, feeding him the life-giving water drop by drop. The elder's cough eased, and a flicker of his old strength returned. The Lord provides a garden in the abyss, whispered on the 3rd day, his eyes clear for the first time since they had entered the deep passages. He looked at the bundle of texts which had kept dry. But a garden is not a destination. It is a respite. We have been granted a small mercy. The path forward, asked, I do not know it from here. The old stories did not speak of this place. The old stories were of escape, said. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the mossy wall. Our task is not to escape. It is to deliver. He gestured to unwrap the bundle, carefully broke the wax seals and unrolled the oilcloth. Inside, wrapped in soft doe skin, were not 1 but 3 books. 2 were thin codices, their pages filled with a delicate, angular script. The 3rd was older, heavier, its wooden covers bound in cracking leather. This was the one indicated. The Book of John, said, his voice filled with reverence. Not the apostle's tale as Rome tells it, but the secret words spoken to him by the Master, of the 2 principles, of the world of light and this world of shadow. His hand, trembling with more than age, reached out and touched the cover. It is too heavy now. My body is a poor vessel, and the ink is fading. The word must be replanted. Looked at him uncomprehending. Replanted here. Not here, corrected gently. He took a long, slow breath, gathering his final reserves. You are the strongest. You will take the other books, the Gospels of the Cathars, and continue the journey. Find a new home for them, a new made of hearts, not stone. But this one, he slid the heavy Gospel of John across the mossy floor. This one cannot risk the journey. It is the root. The others are but branches. The root must be hidden, where no man would think to look for a book. He looked past, into the shimmering, silent dark of the grotto. It must be buried in the memory of the mountain itself. Tristan and stared, confused, but understood. He saw the terrible, beautiful logic of it. Was not just talking about the book. No, said, the word a stone in his throat. We do not leave our own. I am not your own, replied, his voice gaining a sudden powerful resonance that filled the grotto. I am a shell. My time in the world of shadow is ending, but I can serve one final purpose. I can be the vessel for the word, the final page of the book. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression. Leave me the last of the lamp oil. It is all the light I will need. The silence that followed was a physical presence, more solid than the stone walls. It was a silence made of shock, of grief, of a terrible and unwelcome understanding. Tristan's breath hitched, a tiny sound of protest swallowed by the grotto's immense quiet. Simply stared, his face a mask of incomprehension, his gaze shifting from the frail old man to the heavy book on the mossy floor as if trying to weigh one against the other. Knelt, the movement slow, unwilling. He looked not at the book but into his eyes. The light in them was not of the lamp, nor of the phosphorescent moss. It was an internal fire, burning low but pure. "There must be another way," said, his voice a low plea, the last argument of a man who knows he has already lost. "This is the other way," voice was gentle, the voice of a father explaining the turning of the seasons. "You think of the body. You are a good man, a loyal man. You think of carrying my weary flesh a few more leagues through the dark. But the word is not flesh. It cannot be sustained on water and hope. It needs a sanctuary as absolute as the faith that birthed it." He gestured, a slight tremor in his hand, towards the untouched darkness at the far end of the grotto. There, in the heart of the mountain's sleep, who would look for a book there? Who would desecrate a tomb that is already a temple? The logic was flawless, insane. It was the logic of a faith that saw the material world as a prison to be shed. Tristan finally broke, sinking to his knees, his hands covering his face, but he made no sound. His shoulders shook in the pale, steady light. Looked at, his eyes asking the question he could not voice, "Do we obey?" Saw it all in an instant. The long, impossible journey ahead, the weight of the other texts, the hunting hounds of the Inquisition closing in on a false scent. And he saw, not as a man to be abandoned, but as a weapon being aimed, a final, silent act of defiance against the world of shadow. He was choosing his own end, transforming his death from a defeat into a sacrament. To deny him this would be the true betrayal. Slowly reached out. His hand did not touch. It went to the small clay lamp, its flame a tiny, precious star. He lifted it. The encampment was a study in contrasts. On the lower slopes, near the mouth of the main cave, men at arms moved with practiced efficiency. They checked their armor, sharpened their blades, and spoke in the low, pragmatic tones of soldiers preparing for a straightforward, if unpleasant, piece of work. They were here to seal a tomb, to follow orders. The mountain loomed over them, its limestone face gray and impassive in the afternoon sun. Higher up, near the smaller fissures and suspected exits that pocked the gorge La Frau, a different energy prevailed. Here, under the direct supervision of Brother, the work was less military and more ritualistic. The Inquisitor moved among the soldiers, his black robes a stark intrusion on the landscape. He was not giving orders for a siege, but for a consecration in reverse. He spoke of sealing the mouths of hell, of purifying the mountain not with fire, but with stone and mortar. His fervor was a contagion, and the men worked with a grim intensity, their faces set. They were not just blocking holes, they were battling demons. Watched from a promontory, a map fluttering in his hand, held down by a rock. Stood beside him, a statue carved from patience. The tracker's gaze was fixed on the main cave entrance below. "He will be there," said, more to himself than to the tracker. "He intends to go in himself." Did not turn. His reply was a quiet rumble. The lion does not debate with the lamb, it eats it. He believes their words are a poison. He wants to find the antidote in their own scripture and force them to drink it, said, folding the map with a sharp crease. He looked at the tracker. "You are certain of this place?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than certainty crossed his face. It was not doubt, but a hunter's unease when the quarry's behavior deviates from instinct. "The sign was clear," he said. "A map, a destination. It is the move a desperate man would make." "Or the move a clever man would want you to think he would make," murmured. Turned his head slowly, his eyes like polished river stones meeting the seneschal's. "They left a trail. I followed it. My work is done. What happens when the quarry is cornered?" He shrugged, a slight movement of his shoulders. "That is your work or his." He nodded towards the Inquisitor's distant, dark figure. The tracker's world was one of clear signs and physical truths. The theological maze was constructing was a wilderness he had no desire to enter. Yet the seneschal's words had planted a seed. A map, so clear, so helpful. It was an animal leaving a trail of blood for the hunter to follow. Animals did not do that unless they were leading the hunter away from the den where their young were hidden. The last of the lamp oil filled a small stone cup had found, enough to burn for hours. The flame was placed beside the heavy book. With hands that felt clumsy and foreign, rewrapped the two smaller codices, securing them in the oilcloth and doe skin, the burden now his. The weight felt immense, impossible. He rose. And Tristan were already on their feet, their faces streaked with grime and tears. They stood helpless, waiting, looked at each of them. His gaze lingered on Tristan. "Do not fear the dark, son," he said, his voice soft. "It is only a shadow. The light is within you. Carry it well." He then turned to. There were no more instructions, no final orders. None were needed. Their eyes met in a silent transfer of duty. Bowed his head. "Go in God's peace," he whispered. "He is already here," replied, a faint smile touching his lips. His gaze shifted from them to the book beside him, its pages illuminated by the small flame. He was already somewhere else. He was a scholar in his library, a priest before his altar. There was no grand farewell. Simply turned and walked towards the far wall of the grotto, towards a fissure he had noticed earlier, a crack in the stone from which the strange, living air seemed to flow. Followed, pushing the still trembling Tristan ahead of him. They did not look back. To look back would be to undo the sacrifice. They walked away from the small pool of light, away from the man who had been their compass, and plunged into a new, absolute blackness. The sound of their footsteps on the stone was absorbed by the infinite dark. The faint glow of the grotto faded behind them, shrinking to a pinprick, then a memory, until it was gone entirely. For a long time, the only sound was the drip of water and the rasp of their own breathing. The air grew colder, the passage narrower. It began to slope steeply downwards. This was not a way out. This was a way deeper in. Felt a hand on his shoulder and stopped. It was. "Where are we going?" whispered, his voice raw, had no answer. He had no map, no story for this path. He had only final command, deliver it. He reached out, his hand finding the cold, wet stone of the passage wall. They were no longer running from anything. They were moving toward a purpose they could not yet see, through a world that had no name. The weight on his back was no longer just a book, it was a testament. And the darkness ahead was no longer an obstacle, it was the only path left. The stone was a rasp against hands, a cold, indifferent surface that offered no purchase. The passage did not lead up to air and sky, but plunged down, a gullet swallowing them into the unmapped bowels of the earth. The air, once a hopeful current, was now stagnant, thick with the smell of wet clay and a profound mineral stillness. It was the air of a place that had never known a sunrise. Tristan stumbled behind him, a small, continuous sound of fabric and leather against rock. Was a solid, silent presence at the rear, a human anchor against the terrifying pull of the abyss below. They were not escaping. Finally allowed the thought to surface, a shard of ice in his gut. Sacrifice had not bought them an exit. It had bought them a different kind of tomb. The weight of the two codices on his back seemed to press him downward, urging him to join the descent. Each step was a controlled fall into a darkness more absolute than any night. This was a path made of endings. The hope that had bloomed in the phosphorescent grotto had been a cruel and fleeting illusion, a flower growing on a grave. He stopped, his hand flat against the wall. The others bumped into him, a chain reaction of exhaustion. "What is it?" His voice was a dry crackle. Water said, he could hear it now. Not a drip, not a seep, but a low, constant pressure, a deep, subterranean pulse. He took another step and his boots sank into cold mud. The passage ended here. It opened into a cavern not of air but of water. A black, silent lake filled their path from floor to ceiling, its surface as still and reflective as polished obsidian in the faint memory of light. Brother refused a military escort. He chose two young, pale-faced Dominicans to act as his scribes, their satchels filled not with weapons, but with fresh parchment, ink pots, and the Orthodox Gospels bound in white leather. He moved towards the cave mouth with the serene confidence of a man walking into his own cathedral. Soldiers from his contingent parted before him, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. They were men of iron and leather. This man, with his soft robes and his eyes burning with cold fire, was a different kind of weapon altogether. Stood with on the ridge, watching the small procession, the Inquisitor and his acolytes disappear into the yawning darkness of the cave. The trap was set. The beast had walked into the cage. "He carries books to a sword fight," muttered, the words tasting like ash. His gaze was not on the cave. It had been fixed for the last hour on a flight of alpine choughs, high up near the peaks to the east. They wheeled and cried in a pattern he did not like. Birds did not circle an empty cliff. "The map you found," said, his voice low, not turning his head. "The one in the dust." "What of it?" It was drawn by a man with a steady hand. Not a man running for his life. Felt a prickle of cold sweat on his neck that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a message from their leader. "We captured the courier." "You captured a man carrying a message," corrected. "A farmer, paid a few coins to run to a village. He knew nothing." The tracker finally turned to face the seneschal. His eyes were narrowed, focused on a thought that was just taking shape. A good map tells you where to go. A perfect map makes you want to go there. This map was perfect. The choughs cried out again, a sharp, frantic sound. His eyes followed their flight path, tracing an invisible line across the sky. The line did not point to. It pointed miles east, toward the sheer, impassable cliffs of the gorge La Frau. A place no army could assault and no fugitive could hope to scale, unless the mountain itself had a secret door. There was no debate, there was no discussion. To turn back was to return to a tomb sealed by their own hands. To stay was to drown in silence. looked at the black water, then at the terrified face of Tristan, who was staring at his own wavering reflection. He saw the logic, the terrible, final faith of his last lesson. The world of shadow must be passed through. "The books," said to, his voice steady. He unwrapped the oilcloth bundle. "Keep them dry." Took the codices, his face grim but resolved. He understood. This was another kind of baptism. Took a deep breath, the last of this stale, dead air he would ever breathe, and slid into the water. The cold was a physical blow, a mailed fist that clenched around his heart and stole his breath. It was colder than any winter river, a primordial cold from the heart of the stone. He kicked off the floor and plunged forward into the absolute black, his eyes wide open to a darkness that was indistinguishable from the inside of his own skull. He pulled himself along, one hand scraping against the rough stone ceiling of the passage, the other paddling in the icy void. Panic was a creature with claws scrabbling at the edges of his control. His lungs burned. The fire spread through his chest, a desperate, screaming need for air. Just as his body began to convulse, his outstretched hand hit nothing. The stone ceiling was gone. He kicked upwards, his head breaking the surface with a violent gasp. He was in a small, circular chamber, a stone dome with a high ceiling lost in shadow. Air, sweet, fresh, moving air. It smelled of pine and cold sky. He clung to a rock shelf, his body shaking uncontrollably, and shouted back into the water, his voice a raw, broken thing. "It is the way, come." In the vast, cathedral-like chamber deep inside the caves of Brother waited. The torches of his small party cast dancing, monstrous shadows against the limestone walls, making the cavern seem alive and breathing. His scribes stood nervously, their ink pots and books laid out on a flat-topped stalagmite, a makeshift altar. An hour passed. The only sound was the dripping of water and the nervous shuffle of a soldier's boot. The triumphant certainty on his face had begun to harden into a brittle mask. "They mock us," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "They hide in the cracks like insects. They will be found." But standing at the cave entrance in the cold light of day knew the truth. Reports had come in from the teams sealing the upper exits. Nothing, no sign of movement. The mountain was silent. The trap was empty. He looked east, toward the gorge, where had disappeared without a word an hour before, riding as if the devil himself were on his heels. The seneschal had been played. The inquisitor had been made a fool. And a handful of desperate heretics had vanished off the face of the earth. Hauled Tristan out of the water, the boy's body limp with cold and terror. Surfaced a moment later, pushing the oilcloth-wrapped books onto the ledge before him. They lay there, gasping on the stone floor, their bodies racked with shivers, but they were alive. They were through. The passage did not end. It rose steeply from their small island, a narrow, winding staircase carved by water and time, and at the top, a pale gray light beckoned. They climbed. They crawled out not into a forest or a valley, but onto a narrow, windswept ledge no wider than a man's shoulders. The world fell away beneath them into a dizzying abyss of green and gray. They were hundreds of feet up the sheer cliff face of the gorge La Frau. Miles from the army they could see the smoke of its campfires, a faint smudge on the horizon. They were on the wrong mountain, on the wrong side of the chasm, utterly exposed and completely free. The map had been a masterpiece, a lie that had told a deeper truth. It had not shown the path of escape, it had shown the location of the cage. Sank to his knees, the wind tearing at his soaked tunic. He looked not at the distant army, but at the precious bundle had saved. He had delivered them. The branches had survived. Far away, buried in the heart of another mountain, the root lay sleeping, waiting for a spring that might never come. Followed his gaze, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He breathed. He didn't send us to an escape route. He sent them to an empty cave. Below them, on the far side of the gorge, a lone rider picked his way through the scree, a hawk circling its prey. He was too far to be a threat, a tiny, insignificant figure in the vast landscape. But he did not ride like a soldier. He moved with a purpose that was chilling in its precision. He stopped, and for a long moment the figure seemed to be looking directly up at them, could not see them. He saw only the disturbed rocks, the unnatural scrape marks on a path no sheep would take. He saw the impossible exit. He lifted his head, tasting the wind, a hunter who had been tricked, outmaneuvered, and was now filled with a cold, pure respect for his quarry. The chase was not over. The board had simply been reset.